learners, and welcome to the 36th lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century poetry. In this lecture, we will conclude our discussion of W.H. Auden. In the previous lecture, I had completed reading half of the third section of Auden's elegy for William Butler Yeats. I ended with the image that Auden creates for us of Yeats, or rather Yeats's ghost, Yeats's spirit having died and going down or walking in a way that he moves below. And I described how this image that Auden creates is an image that reminds us all of Dante's ghost moving through the underworld. And I further use this occasion to reflect on the different political positions of these two poets, as well as their views on Christianity. Christianity, filtered through poetic achievement, is what creates the common ground for these poets. And it is a powerful thing because it enables Auden to find the intellectual and emotional resources to praise a poet whose life and personality contained many things that Auden as a person would have found quite disagreeable. So let us try and understand the terms, the manner in which Auden finds a reason to appreciate Yeats. Auden asks the spirit of Yeats to go down into the bottom of the night and, with his unconstraining voice, persuade us to rejoice. So it is these two words, the word rejoice and pity. Auden asks the spirit of Yeats to go to the bottom of the night, that is, to find something that is unpalatable, inconvenient, not very pleasant, not very hopeful, and yet, despite being surrounded by these despairing realities, to find or to encourage others, that is, the living. And here, Auden means that the words that Yeats has left, those words will act as the spirit of Yeats. So, just like the spirit of Yeats makes his way through the underworld, similarly, the words that remain in Yeats's poems will persuade readers like Auden to find hope, to rejoice, despite being surrounded by very less actual reasons to rejoice. Further, with the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse, sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. So these lines verge on the almost too popular, and they threaten to slide from popular praise to populist praise. However, I believe one can very carefully understand how Auden manages to not cross that line, or manages to avoid slipping or sliding into populism. Let us try and understand very clearly what these lines achieve. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse. Right? So, curse means faced with a situation that is unpleasant, inconvenient, difficult, but also unchangeable. That is what a curse is. Someone else decides that our situation is going to be unpleasant, and we don't have a choice but to accept it. In this case, in this situation, how can one deal with it? Yeats's example, if one can follow it, is to create a poem out of it, to write poetry in a difficult, impossible situation, and thereby, by doing so, to make the impossibility of the situation a little more bearable. Auden also seeks inspiration from the way Yeats sang of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. This great subject of Yeats's poetry was the frustration of human desire, the frustration of human ambition. And through such a frustrating subject matter, writing about such a subject matter, Yeats managed to produce poetry of great elegance, of great music, of great power. Now, the final stanza: in the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. Let the fountain of his days teach the free man how to praise. So, the free man, this is a key phrase here: teach the free man how to praise. And the freedom of the man who knows how to praise exists or somehow breaks free or transcends the fact that this man might be in prison. So, finally, then, what are the thoughts that we can take home from Auden's poem about Yeats? Now, the first and most important thing to note is that Auden finds or successfully finds for himself reasons to redeem Yeats from the image that Yeats had created through his own actions of a disagreeable, conservative, strange old man. And a very important thing to note is that the inspiration for doing so comes from Yeats's own work. This is something that Auden does for Yeats, but he learns how to do it from Yeats himself. As we have seen in the poems about the Easter 1916 rebellion, Yeats finds through the writing of an elegy grounds to sympathize with people with whom Yeats had very little in common. So, in the poems of Yeats that we have discussed, the elegy becomes a meeting ground for a poet with extremely right-wing views, aristocratic views. Yeats did not really believe in democratic, republican, constitutional nationalism. Yeats believed in feudal, aristocratic, classical ideas. But the occasion of remembering someone who had passed away and the necessity of writing a poem about this person based on that memory, these things, the occasion, the necessity, the poem, the memory, these things produced a transformation. They created a space for sympathy despite the staggering and sharp political differences. The same thing was repeated in Auden's poem about Yeats. The necessity of writing a poem, the necessity to turn Auden's memory of Yeats into a poem, that necessity produces a re-evaluation of the meaning of poetry, a calculated, a very, very strategic statement about the limited potential of poetry, but also the limited truth or the limited potential of poetry to create a new truth. All of this despite the staggering political differences between Auden, the writer of these poems, and Yeats, the person who Auden was remembering. It's important to note also that Yeats teaches Auden to do something that Auden wants to do for Yeats himself. This is also an instance of how 20th century poetry is structured like a series of conversations, a series of mentorships, a series of chain reactions in which older poets inspire younger poets to go further, to challenge them, to outwrite them, to supersede them. But as they do that, the younger poet's work extends, repeats, and carries on a conversation with the older poet's work. In a way, what we see in this poem about Yeats by Auden is an idea that is proven right, an idea that was suggested by another poet, namely T.S. Eliot, the idea of the way the tradition works through the writing of an individual poet. For Eliot, the whole mind of Europe is assimilated, internalized by a poet, and then the entire tradition is modified slightly when a poet, a new young poet, writes a poem that is recognized as valuable. So when Auden writes this poem and people appreciate it and remember Yeats through Auden's words, the elegy that Auden writes subtly modifies each of the elegies that were written earlier. And the important thing to note is that Auden here manages to do something that privileged white or European or Western poets had been trying to do but had failed. And what is that? To write about grief in a way that speaks to collective social experiences of suffering and less to personal individual loss. To be sure, Auden remains a privileged white, Caucasian, European, American, educated person. And Yeats was even more of the same. But in the effort that Auden makes to redeem Yeats, despite his many failures, despite his quite regressive conservatism, to make Yeats into an ideal subject, a subject deserving of the sympathy and the attention that such a moving and powerful elegy merits. In that effort, Auden is doing something to the tradition of the elegy. What Auden is doing is he's remaking the tradition, taking it away from the hands of privileged, educated, elite European writers and making it into something which will be useful for poets with less privilege, poets who come from different communities, poets who do not share some of these assumptions of the elegy. The assumption of the elegy is that a famous person who has died and others must praise this person simply because he's now dead. Or others must praise this person despite the many problems this person had, despite his many failures. The first thing Auden's elegy does is that it humanizes the person. It says, just because a famous person has died, we are not under any obligation or pressure to praise this person. We must we must remain intelligent and skeptical, and we must find a way to say all that was wrong, all that was problematic about this person, while we praise him or her for what they did right. So Auden moves the needle a little bit in the direction of honest appreciations, critical appreciations. However, Auden cannot do much given the limitations of his own privilege and his situation. The work of democratizing the elegy, the work of transforming the elegy from a medium that was used by privileged people to praise other privileged people, however critically and honestly that praise might be. That tradition would be challenged later by an African American poet whose name is Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes would take what Auden had begun doing and do it much better, do it much more powerfully. Mainly because Hughes would use the tradition of the elegy to create a public form of grieving. A form of grieving that was collective, not simply because a lot of people remembered a famous dead person, but because the deaths that were mourned by a collective, by a group of people, were very complicated, sometimes obscure, and sometimes not famous at all. In fact, it was the lack of fame that defined the subjects of Hughes's elegies. African American people who suffered because of their simply because of them being born as African American or black. This would happen much later, but we can see how Auden, in his own way, creates the grounds for that. Now, since we have some time, we will reflect on one more elegy before closing the chapter on Auden for good. This is another elegy, and really, Auden had a remarkable period in the year 1939 when he wrote several elegies. He categorized these poems as occasional verses, and these were collected in the volume Another Time. The second elegy that Auden wrote during this period was In Memory of Sigmund Freud. I will read this briefly and then provide some thoughts on how it can be interpreted. When there are so many we shall have to mourn, when grief has been made so public and exposed to the critique of a whole epoch, the frailty of our conscience and anguish, of whom shall we speak? For every day they die among us, those who were doing us some good, who knew it was never enough, but hoped to improve a little by living. Such was this doctor. Still at 80, he wished to think of our life, from whose unruliness so many plausible young futures, with threats or flattery, ask obedience. But his wish was denied him. He closed his eyes upon that last picture, common to us all, of problems like relatives, gathered puzzled and jealous about our dying. So I've read 4 stanzas, and I will briefly comment on them before moving on. The first thing that Auden notes is that we are living in a time, we as in Auden himself, the poet, the speaker of these lines, as well as the readers of these lines, people who would read these poems at the time it was composed and published in the year 1939. The English-speaking public in the year 1939 was living in a time when death had become too common. Not only death, but grief itself had been made so public and exposed to the critique of a whole epoch. So why is this so? Why is it that grief becomes so ordinary? And the poet is faced with this confusion, a challenge, how to justify the choice of deciding and writing a poem about one person, Sigmund Freud. The poet feels a compulsion to give some justification. Why? Because this is a time of war. Death is common. So many people are dying all around them. So it's difficult to choose. And yet, this is a choice that the poet has made because there are legitimate reasons for mourning, choosing to mourn this person, because choosing to mourn one person inevitably means choosing to not mourn several others. Mourning or remembering Sigmund Freud is worthwhile, even if it means that several other deaths will remain unmourned in these times of war and suffering. So this is what the first 2 stanzas convey. The third stanza conveys that this doctor was one among many others who were doing some good in this difficult time. So it's a difficult time, it's a time of war and suffering. Some people are causing the suffering, and a few people are doing what they can to ease, reduce, alleviate the suffering. The stanza begins, such was this doctor. Still at 80, he wished to think of our life, from whose unruliness so many plausible young futures, with threats or flattery, ask obedience. Right? So he did something. He wished to think of our lives, from whose unruliness so many plausible young futures, with threats of flattery, ask obedience. So he wanted to explain to us where was that chaos coming from. Our lives are so chaotic that people are driven to desperation. People whose lives are short, whose lives are driven short by their desperation to give some sort of an understandable shape to this chaotic life. He wanted to do that. He wanted to give some shape, some order. But the fourth stanza goes, but his wish was denied him. He closed his eyes upon that last picture, common to us all, of problems like relatives, gathered, puzzled, and jealous about our dying. So the problems like relatives, this is a very important word. Freud was a psychoanalyst. Among Freud's chief achievements was to reveal something very scandalous about the polite, proper, aristocratic, and bourgeois society of turn of the century Austria and Vienna. Freud was treating a lot of middle class bourgeois patients. People would come to Freud complaining of mysterious ailments, pains in limbs, inabilities to function, disabilities, a lot of physical pain, symptoms of pain or manifestations of pain, which did not seem to have any medical or any medically recognizable causes. So people who seemed to be healthy or who on paper were declared healthy came to Freud with complaints of pain. And when Freud would talk to these people, he devised a treatment of psychoanalysis, which he called the talking cure. Freud talked to people, asked questions, invited patients to reflect on their lives, to reflect on their childhood, to reflect on their relationships, to reflect on their dreams, to reflect on feelings that they sometimes did not even recognize themselves as having. So as these patients talked, Freud revealed a picture of what was truly going on. And while patients talked and while Freud listened to them, paid attention, and analyzed their words, Freud was able to piece together a narrative of the patient's life, and which often revealed to Freud and the patient the cause of their suffering. In many cases, these causes happen to be illicit desires. They happen to be relationships or feelings that many of these patients and their families had repressed. Often it involved children having witnessed forbidden things, like children stumbling on adults either in the course of performing bodily functions or adults engaging in sexual intercourse. These realities were quite scandalous, and Freud was able to find that often the relationships that we have with people, they contain certain hidden truths, and it is in these hidden truths that maybe the cause of our illnesses may lie. So, relatives and problems, the words that Auden uses in the fourth stanza of this poem in memory of Sigmund Freud, these two things were deeply related in Freud's method. And Auden's point is that it is ironic that Freud could not escape these problems. His own relatives were gathered, puzzled, and jealous about his dying, just like it happened to Freud's own patients. The sixth and seventh stanza go like this. For about him till the very end were still those he had studied, the fauna of the night and shades that had still waited to enter the bright circle of his recognition, turned elsewhere with their disappointment as he was taken away from his life interest to go back to the earth in London, an important Jew who died in exile. Again, Auden constantly juxtaposes the specific, particular details of Freud's life as an individual human being and connects these specific details to the historical forces that were shaping the world in the 20th century. For about him till the end were ghosts. So who are these fauna of the night and shades that waited to enter? And why are these things that Freud had studied? Freud coined the phrase the unconscious. Freud believed that we all have in our minds a place where we store things, feelings, ideas, truths that we find too difficult to accept. These are repressed memories, repressed or unconscious memories. And some examples of these repressed feelings or unconscious feelings are like the sexual desire of sons for their mothers, or the sexual desires of daughters for their fathers. For Freud, these are things that every human being, every child undergoes at some point. But while they grow up, it is the process of growth and maturity, which means that these primordial feelings are repressed, they are dismissed. Similarly, there are many other repressed feelings. All of these repressed feelings are stored in a place called the unconscious. And Freud's view was that human beings are often driven not simply by what they consciously want, but also the deep reservoir of unconscious feelings. So the fauna of the night, shades, these are unconscious feelings and ideas which individuals and societies had repressed. Auden's point is that the ideas that Freud had studied, they were swirling about him while Freud lay on his deathbed. And there's a further twist to the story, because the unconscious feelings which had created the warlike situation, those remained undiagnosed. So what is war? Civilization. Towards the end of his life, Freud had written about war. Freud had written about civilization. War and civilization can be understood as the explosion of repressed feelings and ideas. Freud often called civilization as full of discontent. So because human beings are unable to express some feelings and some desires, they channel their energies towards things that they are able to do. So, for instance, the desire for wealth, the desire for physical domination, the desire for controlling certain territories, all of these desires, the desire that dictators have for controlling and conquering territories and people, these feelings can be diagnosed in a psychoanalytic manner as emerging from unfulfilled, repressed desires. So even though Freud had done so much work to analyze and understand exactly why societies go wrong, the mistakes that nations were making were all around us, and Freud lay on his deathbed. In fact, the deathbed on which Freud lay was in exile. And why was that? Why was Freud forced to live in exile? Because of the Second World War, because Germany had invaded Poland, and because Freud was a Jew, he was no longer safe. So if only the results, the conclusions, the insights, the findings of Freud's research, if the results of Freud's study were successfully incorporated by people around him, maybe he would not be in exile. Maybe societies would not keep going into war. Maybe the German nation would not turn into such a fascist state. Maybe the Jews would not be persecuted like they were, and maybe the Holocaust would not have taken place. Sorry. This is another irony, a tragic irony of Freud's time. Further, only hate was happy, hoping to augment his practice now, and his dingy clientele who think they can be cured by killing and covering the garden with ashes. They are still alive, but in a world he changed simply by looking back with no false regrets. All he did was to remember like the old and be honest like children. And now we reach a point where Auden describes the strong parallels between psychoanalysis and poetry. He wasn't clever at all. He merely told the unhappy present to recite the past like a poetry lesson, till sooner or later it faltered at the line, where long ago the accusations had begun, and suddenly knew by whom it had been judged, how rich life had been and how silly, and was life forgiven and more humble, able to approach the future as a friend, without a wardrobe of excuses, without a set mask of rectitude, or an embarrassing overfamiliar gesture. No wonder the ancient cultures of conceit, in its technique of unsettlement, foresaw the fall of princes, the collapse of the lucrative patterns of frustration. If he succeeded, why, the generalized life would become impossible, the monolith of state be broken, and prevented the cooperation of avengers. Of course, they called on God, but he went his way, down among the lost people like Dante, down to the stinking fosse where the injured lead the ugly, life of the rejected, and showed us what evil is, not, as we thought, deeds that must be punished, but our lack of faith, our dishonest mood of denial, the concupiscence of the oppressor. If some traces of the autocratic pose, the paternal strictness he distrusted, still clung to his utterance and features, it was a protective coloration. For one who'd lived among enemies so long, if often he was wrong and at times absurd, to us he is no more a person now, but a whole climate of opinion, under whom we conduct our different lives. Like whether he can only hinder or help, the proud can still be proud, but find it a little harder. The tyrant tries to make do with him, but doesn't care for him much. He quietly surrounds all our habits of growth and extends till the tired in even the remotest miserable duchy. So, what Auden creates for us is a powerful sense of what Freud had achieved and how his legacy will continue to shape our times. For Auden, psychoanalysis is a lot like poetry. It's a lot like poetry because it involves narration. And a brilliant summary of Freud's talking cure is given by Auden. According to Auden, Freud was not really very clever because he did something which poets have been doing and which poets are not that good at even. What is that thing? According to Auden, Freud merely told the unhappy present to recite the past like a poetry lesson, sooner or later, till it faltered at the line where the accusations had begun. So there is a faith. So this is an act of faith to narrate, to write, to talk about one's life, to analyze, to pay attention to what one hears about a patient's life. In the doctor, in the psychoanalyst, Dr. Sigmund Freud, in the poet, W.H. Auden, both have faith. Both practice their faith by using it to pay attention. Both have faith in the act of narration because they know that if one pays attention, narrates truthfully, then one will come to a point where one realizes who is accusing whom, who is judging whom, what the truth is. And one has the opportunity to make a choice, whether to continue to stay with resentment, whether to hold on to insults, injuries, offenses committed in the past, and to keep seeking revenge, to keep building and consolidating one's ego in a selfish, aggressive manner. This is one choice. Or to forgive, to accept that people make mistakes, to allow people the chance to make mistakes, to acknowledge that just like us, other people also can be selfish, silly, self-centered, and not very intelligent. If the lessons of Freud are accepted by society, and this is what Auden means by the word, that he is not a person but a whole climate of opinion. If the climate of Freud's opinion is allowed to enter our lives and we can meaningfully inhabit that climate, we will find that our world, our war ridden, conflict strewn, violent world in which so many of us are suffering, that world can be improved. It can be improved because we can make better choices. And this, for Auden, is Freud's legacy. And this, for Auden, is a very good reason for us to remember and to continue to keep Freud's work alive through better choices. Our discussion of W.H. Auden concludes here. We will move on to the work of other poets, such as Langston Hughes, in the next lecture. Thank you.